Laura Blumenfeld, who's been with us all evening, former senior advisor on the State Department's Israeli-Palestinian negotiating team. Laura, thanks for joining us again. We mentioned that the Prime Minister is here, starting with this proposal of a 60-day ceasefire that would see the exchange of some Palestinian prisoners, although we haven't seen the actual identity of who that would be, and the release of some hostages over that 60-day period. How far apart are the two sides on that initial part of the agreement?
Well, they've worked out actually a lot of the details. It's already known. Look, they've been hashing these details out for months and months now. The Israelis have reportedly have details of the 20 remaining living hostages and what their conditions are, and as they have to make the difficult choice of which 10 will be released first, because in the initial phase of the ceasefire, especially this temporary ceasefire, only 10 of the 20 remaining will be released. The same can be said for the Palestinian prisoners. They know who the high-value prisoners are, and the exchange rate, because it's an awful thing, but this is kind of a human exchange. As far as the issues go and what the kind of complicated sticking points are, it's that sense of permanence, whether this will be a permanent ceasefire, but we are seeing some flexibility on the smaller points. For example, the issue of aid distribution. The Israelis are showing some flexibility. They're ready to kind of turn that back to the UN and away from this other mechanism that was backed by Israel and the United States. Very controversial. Also the idea of the Hamas leadership going into exile. I mean, the truth is there are very few leaders left. Maybe a canoe rather than a cruise ship would take them into exile. Certainly a symbolic leadership leaving the strip would be acceptable to Israel and possible for Hamas. So we are seeing some movement. I think the real sticking point is the sense of surrender. Netanyahu wants to be able to say, we won. And that's something that I think Trump can help him with. He can kind of confer that authenticity and validity on him. So we're getting there. We're getting closer.
Okay, Laura, as we're speaking, we are still waiting, of course, to see if we get some of those images from inside the White House right now. In the meantime, we can show some of the images from a bit earlier in the day at the Blair House when the Israeli Prime Minister met the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. There you see the images of the two men shaking hands there, seated next to each other. We know that Marco Rubio, of course, has been a close part of this process. We just saw the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff here we see, and of course we saw actually as well the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations just off to the side a moment ago, Danny Danon. So those are some of the images. Steve Witkoff here now seated as well. We know, Laura, that Steve Witkoff is headed to Doha to try to move these negotiations along. I am wondering, however, with the Trump administration, President Trump in February talked about the U.S. plan to, quote, take over Gaza, building this Riviera in the Middle East, in Gaza. Why do you think we're not seeing President Trump speak about that as much anymore?
I think it's really the key Gulf states. I've always thought of them as the kind of swing voters as we vote for peace. And they have been swinging away from that. They put, tremendous behind the scene pressure on President Trump and said, this is a no-go. This is a red line for us. And I think that they kind of offer a kind of good counterbalance to some of the more radical ideas that both Trump and Netanyahu's right-wing cabinet members are putting forward. A lot of this for President Trump is about personal relationships. Netanyahu will say publicly that Trump is Israel's best friend, but I promise you that privately, that 3 a.m. staring up at the ceiling in frustration, Netanyahu has been, disappointed by Trump because of the way that he's sort of taken his own path, whether it was, negotiating with the Houthis or opening up direct negotiations with Iran or sitting down face to face for the first time with Hamas, which previous administrations haven't done. So it isn't only all about, what Netanyahu wants. There's a lot of folks out there saying that Trump is being played by Netanyahu, but, Trump can whack back pretty hard himself.
Okay, Laura, as always, thank you again for that analysis. Laura Blumenfeld speaking to us there.